Today of all days. Don't say a word.
Okay. But why is it black?
Extra crispy, my favorite.
Have you figured out what day it is yet?
Of course, hon. Happy, anniversary?
No.
You know, back in my day.
Dad, not
Are you and Mom going to get a divorce? Also, what's a divorce? Also, what's a boomer? And why do you keep calling Grandpa one?
Oh, hey, hon.
What a beautiful meal.
And happy birthday.
Nope.
Yeah.
I was watching the news today, and you know.
Grandpa's teeth filling mashed potatoes again. Also, where do babies come from?
All right. Well, today we're in the final part, the conclusion of our series called Awkward Dinners, which means it's the last time we're going to get to see that little skit, which is sad, but I don't know. All right, so if you're just joining us, what we like to do is we take our messages, we group them together in what we call a series under a common theme. Sometimes they build on one another, but when they do, sometimes we'll try to fill you in a little bit. And so we've been talking about some awkward dinners or some awkward meals. Some of you have caught on, a few of them have actually been lunches, but they're awkward meals. And in each one of them, there's a pretty profound point, message to be taken away. But before we jump into it, I'll tell you my final awkward story, all right? Final awkward story of the series. So when I was about 12 years old, maybe 11 years old, my family was hanging out with another family, and we had like kids the same age, you know, and so I was there, my sister was there, my brother was there. My brother was probably about 5, 6, 7, somewhere around that age. So we go to the movies with this family. It was a matinee in the middle of the day. I don't remember what movie we saw. We saw the movie. It was great. When it was over, we went into the lobby of the movie theater, you know, where you get the popcorn and all the snacks and whatever. And we're saying our goodbyes, but my little brother doesn't want the party to end. And so he does that thing, you know, that 6, 7-year-olds do when they don't want the party to end. He's like, can they come back to our house? Can we go back to their house? Can we have dinner together? And he's just like, you know, all the parents are feeling a little like uncomfortable, like trying to read the other ones. You know, we have a rule in my family: our kids are not allowed to do this, really, because of this situation with my brother. So he's doing it, and my parents are trying to read the other parents. I'm like, okay, I guess we don't really have plans. And so the other parents are like, okay, how about you guys come to our house? And so they're like, all right. So we decided we're going to go over there. Now, I was talking to my friend there, and I was like, hey, since we're all going to the same place, can I ride in your minivan? He was like, yeah, sure, no problem. So he asked his dad. His dad's like, cool. So I jump in, get in the back seat, third row of the minivan. I'm sitting in the back. Everybody piles into the car. And then his mom gets into the passenger seat, turns on the car. You know, we pull away, and she goes, she's like, I'm sorry, guys. I was not planning on spending the whole day with them. And I'm like, oh no. She doesn't know I'm in the car. And her husband's at the wheel, and he gives her one of those like looks like, don't go there. She missed it though. She didn't see it. And so she just keeps going. She's like, yeah, I mean, I had plans. I don't know, maybe some of you had plans, but Nick, he just was like, can we please? And she's just going on. She's not saying anything horrible, but she's speaking very freely. And I'm just sitting there like shrinking in the back, knowing this is going to be like hoping to get bailed out. My friend is sitting in front of me in like one of those captain's chairs. He turns around, looks at me, and he goes, well, this is awkward. I was like, yes. Yes, it is. And then finally somebody goes, hey, Lou's in the back. And then it just got silent the whole way back, the whole way. So we get there. I get out of the car, and she comes up to me. She pulls me aside. She was super, super nice and graceful about it. She was like, I'm so sorry. I should not have said any of those things. You guys are always welcome. But, you know, I just wasn't planning on this and whatever. But we're still excited to have you guys here. And I was like, trying to make her feel better. I was like, yeah, sure. Don't worry about it. And my parents do the same exact thing. So she was like, okay. So anyway, that meal, it was a little bit awkward while we're eating, but it ended up being fine. throughout this series, we've been looking at some awkward dinners with Jesus. Jesus sat through a lot of awkward dinners. Some of them were lunches. But at each one of these meals, either someone says something or someone doesn't say something or someone's waiting for him to say something. And it's just not smooth. It's not comfortable. But at each one of them, there's a pretty profound point that Jesus makes. So important that all of these points, all of these stories were written down. The story specifically that we're looking at is recorded by a guy named Luke in what we call the gospel, the good news about Jesus, according to Luke. And he loves these awkward meals, these awkward situations. He records a ton of them. And the thing that's so important to know for this series, so important, is that Luke, for most of his life, was not part of the religious community. He kept the religious community at a distance. He wasn't necessarily welcomed in for most of his life until eventually he began to believe that Jesus was who he said he was. And then he was pretty on board. But then he wrote this to people who are like the way he was, right? People who are like not in the religious community, maybe pushed out, maybe they just had no interest in them. We call them like a not for me, like not really for me. And so he wants people to see, look how Jesus responds to people that don't fit like the typical religious mold. And so if you're here today and you don't typically fit the religious mold, there are a lot of people here that are like you, and Luke is writing to people like you to show people like you and me what it looks like, the way Jesus responds to people who don't necessarily fit the religious mold, and also how he responds to people who do. And there are some amazing lessons that we can take away here. I can't go into all the different messages because it's been a long series at this point, but there's a few key points that I have to point out to bring us up to speed here, especially if you haven't been here. The first meal, the first dinner, the first awkward situation is at a party, and it's around a table. It's at a banquet. Now, what you need to know, in case you missed this, or if this is your first week here, the table to eat with someone in the ancient world was a pretty bold statement. It communicated acceptance, intimacy, friendship. People were extremely picky about who they ate with because of what it said to everyone else and to the person that they were eating with. In fact, as a bad example of this, you had these self-righteous religious teachers who wouldn't even eat with people who were not religious teachers because they didn't want to communicate that they approved of what everybody else was doing. And so eating in the ancient world was a bold move. And so the first recording we have of Jesus eating with people where it doesn't go totally well is with a guy named Levi, who's a tax collector. And he was seen really as someone who had betrayed his own people, someone who had turned his back on his own people and was getting rich off of oppressing his own people, his family members, friends of his family. Someone who was working with the enemy, like the Roman Empire. And Jesus eats with him, and people are like, what in the world? And what we talked about was really how the table for Jesus over and over and over again, it was this place of radical acceptance. And he makes room for everyone at this table. That's the main idea behind this story. And it starts out in a pretty bold way. There is a posture of acceptance that Jesus has toward everyone, radical acceptance. And we should have that posture as well if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus. This idea of radical acceptance or undeserved favor, I'm in your corner, whether you did anything to deserve it or not. We're in your corner, whether you did anything to deserve it or not. That's the idea. We have a word for that in the church world. We call it grace. And this is how Jesus led. He led with grace. And so he makes room at the table for everyone. And at first, the religious crowd has kind of a problem with that. But in the very next scene, the very next meal, dinner, it was actually a lunch, Jesus eats with a religious teacher. He sits at the table with a religious teacher, a judgmental religious teacher, and still he's communicating you're good with me too. He shows radical acceptance toward this person too. The guy's name is Simon, and he can't wrap his mind around the idea that Jesus is forgiving and accepting of all these people that don't do the right thing. And Jesus basically explains to him, like, hey, we're all in the same boat here. He shows what we call like extreme forgiveness. Not just to this person who crashed the party that Jesus was at, but also to Simon, this religious teacher. This lady showed up during the meal. She's just referred to, we don't know what her name was. We don't know exactly what she did. She's just referred to as like the sinner woman, which is a terrible way to refer to anyone. But that's how she's described, and Jesus like shows her an embrace. He even sticks up for her to the religious crowd. He shows radical acceptance, extreme forgiveness. And then on the third week, this was an important one. Like if you're wondering why, like what's his rationale behind accepting everyone, it's really because of this, we could say process or formula that we apply to all of our relationships. It's this idea of first getting to know someone, and then as you get to know them, you begin to trust them. And as you trust them, then you begin to obey or listen to them. He's talking to these two sisters. There's this one who's like trying to do all the obeying. She's trying to do the right thing, do it. And then you have this other sister who's just sitting and getting to know him. And so the one who's doing the doings gets on the case of the other sister. And she's like, Jesus, will you tell my sister to start doing what I'm doing? And Jesus is like, no, she's actually chosen the necessary thing. This is the place to start, to just sit and listen. And so if you're someone who's new to church and no one ever gave you the time to just sit and listen and ask questions and figure out, like, is this for me? Do I actually believe that? Express your doubts, ask your questions. Then that's on us, right? Like then the church has skipped this process. Often churches start here, like obey. We look at like the rest of the world and like, you gotta obey. And Jesus will be like, no, the starting point is here. This is how it applies, this is how it works. And when we skip this process, it never feels right. And so throughout this whole story, we see Jesus over and over again butting heads with the religious teachers or the religious authorities. They seem to constantly have a problem with him. They're constantly the problem in the story. And so if you're watching this, you're seeing, oh, he's fighting with them again. Oh, they're arguing with him again. Like the question is, okay, well, what's the problem with these people? And this is what Tom talked about last week. If these are the bad guys in the story, I'm generalizing here, but if these are the people that keep getting into trouble, how do I make sure I'm not going to become one of them? And Jesus, at another meal with another one of these religious teachers, dives right into this. And he's like, the guy starts judging Jesus for not washing his hands in a certain way before a meal. And Jesus is like, look, let me just lay it out on the table. You guys care so much about what's going on the outside, about how you're perceived, about looking a certain way. You totally neglect what's happening within you. And so Luke's answer to us really is like, if you want to make sure you don't end up like the people who are the problem in this story, we need to investigate and invest within. Jesus said, take care of what's going on the inside, and the outside will take care of itself. And all of this happened over the course of these awkward meals. These dinners where people are like, whoa, did he really say that? And he makes a profound point in each one of them. But this last one, in the time we have left, we're gonna look at the last table, the final table, the table of tables. It is the most important table at the most important meal on the most important day of the year for those ancient Jewish people. Have you ever played, so before open world video games came out where you just walked around wherever you want to? If you don't know what that is, it's not really that important. There used to be like games where you'd beat like level 1, you know? And then you go to level 2. And there'd be a boss. You gotta defeat like the little boss. And then the next level is another boss. And then eventually you get to the final boss. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah? Okay, yeah. So like finally at the end you get to face Bowser himself, you know? Or like Dr. Robotnik, if you played Sonic on Sega Genesis. Yeah, this like It's all these little ones leading up to the big one. That's the idea here. That's what Luke is setting up. No, there's not a boss that you have to defeat. There's no Bowser in the story. But it's like you have these little tables, these little meals, these places of acceptance where Jesus is communicating certain things and teaching certain lessons. And then there's this big, the final table, the table of tables, the meal of meals, the most important table on the most important day of the year. And here's what happens. You might be familiar with this table, but it's so important that we understand what happens at this table in light of all the other tables. It says this. Luke writes, he says, then came the day of unleavened bread, which is an interesting name for a day. But it was part of their holiday, this big feast, this festival. He says, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So what you need to know is that for them, these ancient Jewish people, they celebrated Passover, right? Maybe you've heard of Passover before, but for them at this time, Passover was the most important day of the year. It was like the most important celebration. For them, it was like Christmas times 10. Right? Like Christmas is pretty important for a lot of people around here. It's like Christmas times 10. It was a combination of a national holiday and also a religious holiday. So they were celebrating, these ancient Jewish people are celebrating their independence as a nation, but they're also celebrating what they believe God did for them. So if you know this story, right, like with Moses, you have these ancient Israelites, they're in slavery in Egypt, hundreds of years before Jesus. They're in Egypt, they're enslaved, right? And then Moses comes along, right? Like 10 Commandments, Charlton Heston, Prince of Egypt. Anybody, right? Moses comes along and he approaches Pharaoh, who's got these people in slavery, and he's like, let my people go, right? And eventually there's all these plagues, all this crazy stuff. Eventually they're taken out of slavery and they're free. And this is a big deal for them, and so they celebrate it every single year. And at this dinner, there were certain things that happened. It's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Day of Unleavened Bread, because on that Passover day, they had bread that they couldn't, like they didn't have the time to wait for the yeast to rise. And so it was unleavened, and they would eat that every year at this dinner. It was a big thing. And so they're celebrating the fact that they're their own people and that God did these amazing things to make that happen. Big deal. Okay, so Jesus is like, all right, I'm gonna eat this with my disciples. Big day. It's like Christmas dinner. Back to it. Jesus sent Peter and John. Now this is interesting. He sends Peter and John, two of his closest friends, closest followers, saying, go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover. Go get it ready. So they ask, all right, well, where do you want us to prepare for it? They asked, and then Jesus gives them a pretty detailed answer. He says, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Oddly specific. He says, follow him to the house that he enters and say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? It's crazy specific what Jesus is telling them is going to happen and what he wants them to do. He says, he will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. And so make preparations there. Peter and John are like, well, we were not expecting that answer, right? So me, I'm critical, I like to ask questions, poke holes in things. I'm like, what is the deal with that? Guy with the jar, does the guy know? Jesus sent someone ahead, tell the guy, hey, be ready, have a jar, put water in it. Like, what's the significance of this? Why? What's the point? The point is, in the very next verse, it says, they left and they found things just as Jesus had told them. What he's doing here is really like priming them. He's about to tell them some things that are really hard to believe at this Passover meal. And so almost to like get them ready for this, he's telling them all these things that are gonna happen. So when they sit down, they're like, well, if Jesus says this, he was right about all those other weird things in the guy with the jar. So maybe there's something to what he's about to do here, or what he's saying he's about to do. He's getting them ready. And so they did it, and they prepare the Passover. It's finally time. It's ready. Biggest day of the year. So it says, Luke writes, when the hour had come, when it was time for the dinner, Jesus and his apostles reclined where? At the table. Those 12 disciples. They reclined, they're sitting at the table. It's the place of radical acceptance. You're good with me. Place of grace, undeserved favor, forgiveness. And they're doing it on the most important day of the year. Now, if you've been tracking with us throughout this series, you might have picked up on the fact that every time there's a meal, someone somewhat unexpected shows up, and Jesus makes a point to remind everyone there's room for everyone at the table. But here, on the most important day of the year, at the most important meal, it seems like it's a little bit exclusive, maybe, right? Like, okay, this is really important. Maybe this one where we just have like his closest friends, like just those 12 guys that have been with him all the time in this upper room someplace. So it seems a little exclusive, right? Okay, so like, where's this going? Where's Jesus going with this? Well, he says to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you. It's like Christmas dinner. I've wanted so badly for us to share this together. He says, before I suffer. And at this point in the story, they're not totally sure what he means by this. Like, he had hinted at the fact that he was gonna die several different times. I mean, he's actually said it plainly several different times, but they still didn't totally know what he meant. And so he's saying, like, this is the last time we're gonna eat together, and I've wanted so badly to eat this meal with you. And so it says, for I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. He won't eat it again, not in this life at least. This is what we call the Last Supper. And then he kind of reiterates this. It says, then after taking the cup, he gave thanks. And he said, take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, and he's repeating himself in essence, but now with the cup. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine. This is a word for wine. He says, until the kingdom of God comes. This is the last time we're going to do this. Now, it says there, if you notice, it says the cup, the cup. Why? Because during this Passover meal, everything that happened was symbolic. Like, it all meant something because they were doing it for a very specific reason, right? Like, maybe at your Christmas dinner, you've got like a Christmas ham, and it's your thing, and you do it every single year, and you look forward to it. It's kind of like that, but with way more significance. They would eat that unleavened bread, the bread with no yeast, to remember how their ancestors must have felt when they had to run out of Egypt. They would drink from like the cup. The cup. It was the same cup that was there every year. It was the cup with so much significance to remember that they had been like purchased and freed, and now they were their own people. The cup of redemption, which means like literally to buy back. And it meant so much to them, and he's doing it, and he's like, this is the last time we're gonna do it together. And then things get a little weird. They get a little awkward, probably. Or maybe not even awkward, like just totally unexpected. It says, Luke writes, he took bread, he gave thanks, normal, and he broke it to share it, normal. He broke it and he gave it to them saying, this is my body. Now, if you're at that table and you're however old, let's say you're 35 years old, for 35 years, you would have been eating this bread. And every time it was broken and given to you, someone would have said, something to the effect of, we eat this to remember what happened to our ancestors when they were in Egypt. This is the unleavened bread. And so when Jesus says, this is my body, your first response would be, no, it's not. That's not how this goes. And in this moment, he is totally redefining what they've been doing for hundreds of years. He says, it's my body and it's given for you. And so you do this in remembrance of me. So my aunt, my great aunt actually, she has a Christmas tree, and every year she has this nativity underneath. And I remember, like every year she's got a manger, and the manger is always empty until Christmas morning. She puts Jesus in there on Christmas morning. So every time when I was younger, I'd go to her house, I'd look at the manger, I'd be like, oh, Jesus isn't in there. Where's Jesus? And she'd be like, it's not Christmas yet. And I would get so excited to see his little, ceramic baby Jesus finally put in there. And then Christmas Day, he would come, they'd put him in there, and be like, oh, Jesus has been born. And I still couldn't touch him because he was fragile. But I was excited to finally see him in the manger, right? This would be like me being like, okay, no more baby Jesus. Now it's about me and my birth. All these presents, all these songs, all the lights you see around Christmas, it's not about that anymore. Now it's about me. Like at first, if I did that, you might be like, no, that's silly. But after a little while, you'd be like, are you nuts? You can't do that. This has been going on for hundreds of years. Who do you think you are? And so he totally redefines it. And it says, in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, that same cup. And he said, this cup is the new covenant, like a new arrangement with God, a new way of relating to God in my blood, not the blood of a Passover lamb, but in my blood, which is poured out for you. And he totally redefines it. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're like me, like we've been totally desensitized to what he's saying. He's saying, you're going to see my body break. You're going to see them crush me. And I want you to know that I'm doing it for you. You're going to see me bleed. We say blood poured out, and it's sanitized, for church. We've gotten used to that term. He's saying, I'm going to bleed, and I'm going to do it for you. And these guys, they would see it. Like hours later, they would see them take a crown of thorns, which is painful to hold if you've ever even touched one. And they would see them like crush it over the top of his head, and the blood pour down his face. The blood he's talking about. They would see like them rip the flesh off of his back, and the blood that's poured out because of it. They would see the nails go in his hands and through his feet. They would see the spear stuck in his side as he hung up on a cross. And he's saying like, when you see that, I want you to know I'm doing that for you. And it's not to create a feeling of guilt or of debt, but to show you and me what he's communicating to them is like, this is what you're worth to me. Or we could say he's saying, like, watch my body break and know this is how much I'll give. And watch me bleed and know, like, this is how far I'll go. And know that all of it is for you. For you. Like, we've been talking about radical acceptance, right? And so we're trying to explain just how quick Jesus was to accept people. But I don't know about you, if you're like me, acceptance, the word acceptance doesn't really like register emotionally for me. When I hear acceptance, I think like, okay, fine. Like, fine. Come on, please accept me. Okay, fine. Or forgiveness, like, all right, you shouldn't have done that, but pretend it didn't happen. Here, he takes the table, the final table, the most important table on the most important day, and in the most important moment of this entire thing, this table of radical acceptance goes from acceptance, radical acceptance, to a relentless pursuit of you and me. He's saying, like, it's not an okay, fine. It's a whatever it takes. I want you to understand this is just how far I'll go. This is just how much I'll give for you. For you. Not to make you feel guilty, but to show you what you're worth to me. We're talking about the church making room at the table. He was the original. Like, he came to make room at the table for you, to make a place for you and for me, which can be hard to wrap your mind around. But the thing we need to know, the thing he wants people to remember is, like, I did this for you. And so here's like the clincher, all right, for me at least. You know, I mentioned before, like, okay, it's just the disciples, it's just the apostles in that room. It seems like kind of a private conversation, an intimate thing. What happened to, like, everyone being welcome here and the people with all the mistakes and the issues? What about them, right? Well, let's put that verse back up here. It says, like, this is the cup blood of a new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Right before this happens, if you step back and look at this verse in context, we actually started here in verse 7. But in verse 1, what Luke tells us is that it was the time for the feast of unleavened bread. And the religious authorities wanted to kill Jesus, but they couldn't figure out how. They wanted to get rid of him, but they couldn't figure out how. Until finally they got to a guy named Judas, who is one of the 12. And they came up with an agreement with Judas. Like, they'd give him money, and Judas would tell them when they could find Jesus, and there'd be no one around to protect him. And Judas agrees. And it says they were delighted. And then the 12, including Judas, all go to eat at this table. And if you're reading this, right, you're reading Luke's original writing, you'd be like, oh no, Jesus is saying all these things, and yet he doesn't know that Judas is there. Like, he doesn't realize that this guy's gonna betray him, and he's saying, I'm giving all this for you. I'm doing all this for you. And yet Jesus says, like, as if to let us know he knows what's going on, in his very next words, he says, but the hand of him who is going to betray me, like, if there's a time to qualify, like, not him, it's here. He says, the hand of him who's going to betray me, ready, is with mine, where? On the table. Right here. It's as if he looks in the eyes of the one who's going to betray him and says, this is how far I'll go, and this is how much I'll do for you. For you. Not because you've earned it, but because of how I feel about you. And so if there's even a part of you that is questioning whether or not you're included, Jesus leaves no room to doubt. There's a place for you here. He came to make room at the table, and there's a seat for everyone. For the tax collectors, the people that don't fit into the religious mold, the people that are not doing what people would agree is good for society, the people that can't quite wrap their mind around the stuff that Jesus is doing, there's a place for you here. And so for the last 2,000 years, people have been doing it. And Jesus is like, when you come together, I want you to do this to remember me. And I don't want you to just talk about it. I don't want you to just sing about it. I want you to taste it and digest it. Engage all the senses. And when you do that, you don't remember the Passover lamb. You remember just how far and just how much I'll give for you. And so today, 2,000 years later, we're going to do that. I've asked the band to help us out here. They're gonna pass around some buckets. They're gonna give like one bucket per row. You could just take, there's a little communion cup inside the bucket. You can take one and just pass it down to the end of the row, and you could put the bucket on the ground. I'd ask you to hold on to it, so we'll take it together. Thanks, Tom. If this is not something you're comfortable doing, please don't feel any pressure to do it. You're welcome to just sit and think or watch or whatever. We're going to pass this out. We have the opportunity to do what he invited us to do 2,000 years ago. There's one time we have recorded where the church went wrong doing this. They didn't just have like a little cracker and a little cup of juice or wine. They would have these big feasts, but they call it the Lord's Supper, and they celebrated this there. There's one time where they went wrong, and it was because certain people sat with certain people. They divided each other up by class, and so the rich sat with the rich, the poor sat with the poor. They'd argue, some would eat a lot, some wouldn't have much. And over time, somehow, the message that was communicated to certain people was that there is not a place for you here. And so the Apostle Paul, who came decades after Jesus, like jumped on that. It was like, can't be that way. You've got to remember what this whole thing is about. It's about all of us having a place at his table, in spite of who we are and what we've done. So throughout this series, we've talked about different people. And you know them if you've been with us. But my question for you today, right now, in the few minutes we have left together, my question is, like, where do you find yourself in this story? There have been a lot of tables before this final table. Which one do you sit at? Like maybe you're like Matthew. You're here today feeling like Matthew, like you're not welcome in the religious community. You don't fit the mold. You know what Jesus would say to you today? He'd say, I have eagerly desired to eat this meal with you because there's a place for you here. Or maybe you feel like Simon, the religious teacher, and you can't quite wrap your mind around the way Jesus accepts so many people who don't listen to him. And maybe you're wrestling with it. And if that's you today, what Jesus would say to you is probably the same thing he would say to Simon, like, hey, you've got some things to think about. But in sitting with him at the table, he communicated that I did this for you too. And I have eagerly desired to eat this meal with you. There's a place for you here. Or maybe you're like Martha, the sister we talked about in week 3, who is working and working and working and trying so hard to do the right thing. And to her, Jesus was like, just sit. There's a place for you here, this table. And you don't have to earn that spot. Maybe you're like one of the disciples. If you know the disciples, those followers of Jesus, they got it so right sometimes. And other times they got it so wrong. And if you look at their journey, it's like up and down, and up and down, and up and down. Maybe that's how you feel. Maybe you're at an up, maybe you're at a down. Jesus would look at them, say, there's a place for you. I did this for you. Or maybe, lastly, maybe you're like Judas. And if you're honest, you look at all this church stuff, all this stuff that stands for Jesus, and if you're honest with yourself, you know you'd end it if you could. Today, Jesus would look you in the eyes, like he did to Judas, and say, this is how far I'll go. And this is how much I'll give for you too. Because there's a place for you at this table if you want. And so that night, Jesus took bread that used to remind them of what happened in Egypt, but bread that he was redefining. And he broke it and he said, this is my body and it's gonna be broken for you. This is how much I'll give for you. So do this in remembrance of me. So you can peel back the bread side of your cup and we can take that together right now. And in the same way, to everyone's surprise, he picked up a cup. And he said, "This is not the blood of the Passover lamb. This is my blood, which will pour it out. Not so you feel guilty, not so you walk around beating yourself up, but so you know how much you are worth to me." So he said, "You do this now to remember me." Let's do it together. He told his disciples that one day he would eat that meal with them again. And the same is true for us. We believe all this. Jesus says, like, one day we will come together and eat with him again at his table. And we can look forward to that. Eating with him at his table. But until then, in the meantime, we'll make room at this one.